This week, my coworkers Chase Snyder and Vlad Babkin join me to discuss Palo Alto devices, how we can keep appliances more secure. Stay tuned. Below the Surface coming up next. Welcome, everyone, to Below the Surface. It's episode number 45, being recorded on Monday, February 3rd, 2025. I'm your host, Paul Asadorian, joined by my two co-workers. Vlad Babkin is here. Not the first time. You've been on the pod before, so welcome back, Vlad.
Hello. Hello there, Paul.
And of
Nice to
course,
see everybody again.
yes, good to see you too, Vlad. Mr. Chase Snyder is here with us. Chase, welcome.
Thank you. Yes, good to be back. My second in a row. Bang, bang.
That's right. That's good. We're working at a good clip. I like it.
Yeah.
Below the Surface listeners, of course, can learn more about Eclypsium by visiting eclypsium.com/go. There you can find the ultimate guide to supply chain security, an on-demand webinar I presented called Unraveling Digital Supply Chain Threats and Risk, a paper on the relationship between ransomware and the supply chain, and a customer case study with DigitalOcean. Of course, you can see our product in action and get a demo, all that at eclypsium.com/go. We do have a webinar coming up too that I think is the top firmware threats that I'm excited about. I think I still owe you a review of that document, Chase. Okay.
No problem.
We need to go forward with that, get that out there so people can register. But that's an internal webinar that we're going to promote and do. I'm excited about that.
Top firmware attack vectors. Yeah, we had a paper about that a couple of years ago, I think, that has still super useful info. But obviously, as you and I have discussed at length recently, the firmware vulnerability, the firmware attack surface game is always evolving. People are building new tools and new techniques, and generally just going after firmware more, particularly as a persistence sort of venue.
It's interesting. We still see, and Vlad, you've done some of this research as well, vulnerabilities and threats against network and security appliances. This is just keeps an actively growing area of both observing threat actor behavior, but also trying to understand how we better protect these devices when, I don't want to say our hands are tied, but defending these platforms poses some significant challenges versus a server that you have more control over, or a cloud instance of something you might have even maybe less control over, but more so than an appliance, right? So this landscape is interesting. Of course, every week we get new vulnerabilities that are being exploited by attackers against the laundry list of vendors that are producing these appliances. And I'm not knocking any of the vendors. We all, like I said before, we live in glass houses. We also make products as well. But there are, I think, certain things about the threat landscape that in threat models that I want to focus the discussion around today. In particular, our findings and disclosures for Palo Alto devices. So for folks listening, if you haven't read our blog post that we put out on January 23rd, there is a list of conditions that we found that are indicative of some of the vulnerabilities that exist on the platform. I use the term platform security largely to address UEFI and other like fundamental things, firmware or chips on the board. If the board has a BMC, as an example, that's done a lot of research in that area. I use it as a general term to describe the basically before the operating system, software, firmware, and vulnerabilities if they exist. So just some terminology to get us started. And just, a brief overview of the disclosure that we published for Palo Alto devices. Certain devices, there's really like two major areas, right? One is the bootloader. In this particular a series of firewalls is using a Linux-based operating system, which was also using Grub 2 as the bootloader. And those of you that follow Eclypsium research will know that we disclosed boot hole in 2020. Eclypsium researchers Jesse and Mickey worked on that and presented it. Essentially, if there's vulnerabilities in the bootloader, and you've got secure boot enabled, those vulnerabilities could allow attackers, do allow attackers, in fact, to bypass the secure boot integrity checking that happened. So what we discovered was that Palo Alto, even though they had their own, I believe, key structure for secure boot, right? They weren't relying on the external inclusions of DB and DBX, which means that secure boot was running, validating Grub, even though Grub was vulnerable because the DBX wasn't up to date. And so, that allows attackers obviously to persist, get in before the operating system provides what we were just describing for the show as stealth and persistence. So, Vlad, Chase, do you want to weigh in on the first part there? Because that was, I think, the major finding. I should also preface that with Palo Alto was aware of this vulnerability and had documented it and stated that an attacker, and I quote, would need to first compromise the system and then get root level privileges, Linux privileges necessary to perform these actions before they could exploit the vulnerability. Now, we've had a series of remotely exploitable vulnerabilities on Palo Alto devices, as well as several other security and network appliances as well, and not just Palo Alto. So that allows an attacker to gain that initial foothold and chain exploits together. CISA just put out a warning about exploit chaining on Avanti platforms. So this is certainly behavior that we're seeing attackers exhibit, right? Chaining exploits together, leveraging multiple vulnerabilities to gain access to a platform. We also saw, it mentions in our report, right? SOFO-specific RIM, we saw attackers trying to persist through firmware updates and get into UEFI. So that was the first disclosure. Vlad, Chase, any additional thoughts there?
I mean, I've got pulled up what Palo Alto said in response to this disclosure, and it seems I'll just read it and then react to it a little bit. But one of the quotes, there was a SecurityWeek.com article that published their responses to this disclosure, and they said it's not possible for malicious actors or Pan OS administrators to exploit these vulnerabilities under normal conditions on Pan OS versions with up-to-date secured management interfaces deployed according to the best practices guidelines. So there's a checklist in that response that they said that not everybody's going to meet. The notion that all of these devices are out there deployed under normal conditions, that they're up to date and have secure management interfaces, and that they've been deployed according to best practices. I mean, people are going to do their best, but it's a complex piece of technology to deploy and manage among a whole suite of other complex pieces of technologies to deploy and manage. Of course, you can misconfigure something. No stones to throw about that. But there's a lot of these like requirements where it's like, it doesn't invalidate the risk that's represented by the vulnerabilities to say that these conditions would have to be met. And the sort of follow-on that they had for that was users and administrators do not have access to the BIOS firmware or permissions to modify it. An attacker would first need to compromise the system and then get root Linux privileges necessary to perform these actions before they could exploit these vulnerabilities. These vulnerabilities themselves do not allow an attacker to compromise the Pan OS software and the firewall. And it's kind of like, yeah, that's exactly what you were saying, Paul. Attack chains. That's how all vulnerabilities are. Very few vulnerabilities exist in isolation. They're part of an attack chain, and these can be a meaningful part of an attack chain, as you outlined in our publication. How these could specifically be used in an attack chain that is not hard to imagine.
So I did a Google before coming into the studio, and latest zero-day I could find on Google, like just a quick Google, I Googled for 1 minute, was in November 2024. So it was not that long ago. It was like, what, now it's February, 2 months passed since then. And like you do have to have really fresh version if you want to be protected under those conditions. And in this case, I guarantee you that a lot of network devices in the wild are not getting regularly updated. Like if you look, for example, I didn't check for Palo Alto specifically, but let me drop another vendor, Microtix, right? They do a good job updating their firmware regularly, and they are on 7th major version, like 7.15 or something like that, maybe even later. I honestly didn't check them before, but you can still find Microtix running 5.x online. Like it's not even a question. Other outdated devices, yes. Like you don't have to ask it. And considering that latest 0 day was like a couple of months ago, not years and years ago, there are probably quite a few vulnerable devices out there.
Yeah.
Moreover, like big questions that I have is that many of them don't follow even simplest best practices, like let's not expose management interface to the internet. So again, I cannot speak specifically about Palo because I didn't do any kind of search for them. Maybe Palo owners are more responsible than others, but as practice shows, quite a lot of network devices actually have network interface facing into the internet. Like, hello attackers, break us with a 0 day whenever you like.
Yeah,
So
it's
yeah,
often quoted when research and vulnerabilities are released against a specific platform, X number of usually thousands of devices is what I've observed in the past year, right? When any one of these vendors has a remotely exploitable vulnerability, someone does the research on Shodan that says that there's X number of these devices that are in fact exposed, which goes to show that people are not following the best practices, which you got to assume that a certain percentage are not going to follow the best practices and not expose the management interface to the internet, or it gets exposed and it's not being picked up on in your attack surface monitoring, if you have such a thing. So there's lots of conditions, right, that lead
yeah.
to the state we're in today. There's tons of these. I think if you search generically on Shodan, you get 80,000 Palo Alto devices. Now,
So
to preface that with, many of those are Global Protect, their VPN solution, which by design has to be exposed to the internet, right? So there's some
mhm.
subset of that. In my estimation, I have not completed the full. In fact, Vlad, it's something you and I probably should collaborate on, right?
Yeah,
Start pinpointing, like, can we query Shodan and get a better picture of who's exposing what to the internet?
yeah. And to be honest, we are in a very weird situation where firewall vendors, like keyword firewall, are asking not to expose their management interface to the
Right.
internet because it's insecure.
Mm.
Like, I understand that it is a security best practice, but think about the irony. And I'm not singling out Palo or anything.
No.
You cannot expose security appliance interface to the internet because it is insecure. And this is the irony we have to live. Like, it's not about a specific vendor. It's just something we have to live with as an industry right now. So it's not. I'm not throwing stones at a glass house in this case. Just important point.
Yeah,
I
I
don't
think
think I
there's
ever saw a device that's an exception to this.
yeah, and again, being very careful. I don't want to knock anyone because we all have this problem, and I want us to get to solutions, right? I want us
Yeah.
to encourage and push vendors to produce more resilient appliances. And I love your point, Vlad, that when you purchase a security appliance, it should be robust enough, it should be resilient enough, I should say, that if the interface is exposed to the internet, there's not an immediate threat or danger. But what we've seen is, and this is across the board, somewhat a generic statement, but if you read some of the write-ups, Watchtower Labs does a great job. Several other security research firms do a great job of going, there was a vulnerability. This is the details behind the vulnerability. This is the decompiled code. Here's where the vulnerability lies. Um, a lot of times those vulnerabilities, one, exist in web management interfaces for a lot of these, not just security appliances, but also IoT specifically as well. And a lot of these vulnerabilities are, go back to smashing the stack for fun and profit. These are not,
Yep.
these are stack based buffer overflows that we've known and understood since computer science wise, Vlad. I mean, you probably go back to what, the
Yep.
70s when we
Yep.
first had the concept of some kind of memory corruption, right? And so I'm like, I'm not super impressed. I'm like, you have this web management function historically, since I've studied this for better part of 25 years, historically, there's been lots of vulnerabilities in the web management interfaces, whether that's in the web logic code or in like the web server itself, which I want to say it was, might have been Fortinet that I read the Watchtower Labs write up on. Um, or it was Avanti, I forget which one, but they, like, it was in the binary that runs to provide the web server, right? And I've seen that time and time again where these have classic memory corruption. um, overflows in them. So there's that. I think we can do better, right? Like, I don't want to knock any one particular vendor over another, but it's a call to action, right? If you
Yeah.
work in product security and you're producing a security appliance, this is an area that requires some focus, right? We need to do better. We need to up
Yeah.
the bar. We need to make sure that these web interfaces are a lot more resilient than they are today.
So to be honest, I would start with just two things. Just two. Thing number one, vendors should not be afraid to voice those vulnerabilities. Like,
Yeah.
read about every single disclosure you have ever read about security appliance, and vendors are always trying to sugarcoat it at least a little bit, because
Mm-hmm.
what would happen is immediate market reaction. Like,
Mm-hmm.
oh hey, Palo Alto just had a 0 day. They're not having a good day right now. So they're afraid of handling yet another 0 day situation. This is why they put a disclaimer that, oh hey, attackers need to have yet another vulnerability to kind of exploit this detection, and they're trying to sugarcoat it. In this case, it's not doing a really good job. Like, yes, they're avoiding a market reaction, but also no, they are giving people false sense of security
Mm-hmm.
where, okay, it is not immediately exploitable, but what if it's applied with a chain? Like, what if there is a 0 day that we don't know
Right.
about yet, that's why it's a 0 day, and somebody is leveraging this other attack to actually persist deep on the device, right? So deep that most normal tools will not be able to find it ever again. And
It's true. Yeah.
but
Because,
but but customers will read it and like, I don't need to patch immediately because it's not a big deal. It's not exploitable.
Yeah, this whole
So
thing is kind of like when you're building products like these, you need to build them for how the median user is going to use them. You can't right now there's a huge burden on the end user to be a high maturity, highly staffed, really
yeah.
high
yep,
execution, and most security shops just aren't that. I mean, by just statistically, most of them are going to, the median user is not going to meet the bar for everything to be deployed
yes,
totally according to best practice and exist under normal conditions. And consumer products, just go through the grinder and have to consumer products don't survive if they're not built for that median user that doesn't really know how to
Right.
do it that well. But security products somehow um, get this pass where there's a high level of expertise and maturity required to get the basic functionality out of them. And then another sort of, concept in security is that of compensating controls. And I think this points, directly to a need for that is that there are always going to be vulnerabilities in products. And it's great to have products in place where if you know the vulnerabilities or loosely what they're going to be, like, okay, exposed web management interface, is probably going to be a risk. Having other compensating controls in place so that that thing doesn't turn into what pwns you is important. And it's so difficult to have those kinds of compensating controls in place when the vulnerabilities aren't disclosed or the severity of the vulnerabilities is downplayed and sugar-coated, as you were saying, Vlad. And so it makes it harder
yeah,
to do best practices when these devices are such a black box and when there's that culture of fear around being upfront about what the vulnerabilities are and what compensating controls could be put in place to nullify them.
Well, and I think you hit on
yep,
a great point there in terms of compensating controls. Part of that, I would point to some type of attack surface management that's constantly running that tells me if I have a management interface exposed, right? It's like security starts with, as many of us know, asset management, knowing what you have. This is almost like the next level of that. Like, I know I have this security appliance, but I also know that the interface for management should never be exposed to the internet. So let me just go ahead and run something all the time that tells me when that happens so I can react to it, right? Because it's easy to say in a small environment, like one person IT shop, like I know everything that's going on, I know what firewalls I have, but you put this in an enterprise that has 100,000 users, 100,000 employees. Think about the infrastructure that results from that. and how quickly you can lose control over, well, what's exposed to the internet, what isn't. If you don't have some automated process telling you that, you're gonna have these exposures, right? And as we're finding, attackers are honing in on this particular exposure right now. Um, and in fact, I talked to a CISO of 100,000 people at a financial organization that was using threat intelligence to learn about what attackers are doing now before the vulnerabilities are exposed on a particular security appliance platform, and got everything ready, right? And this is also to your point, Chase, like their IT team was ready and prepared for it. Like we know, let's say they had 25 of these, particular appliances. We know we're going to have to patch all 25. What do we need to do that safely in our environment? Okay, let's plan for that. As soon as the patch was released, it took them 8 hours. And this is an advanced IT and security team, right? These are like, they're people operating the top of their game, and they've got a lot to manage. And so they did that in 8 hours. But they also said that their monitoring systems observed attacks 20 minutes after the patch was released. So that's another thing that's happening. I think it was one of the other reports I sent you. It might have been from VulnCheck, right?
Yep.
There's also people that track this, like how quickly are attackers looking for things once a patch is released and a vulnerability is disclosed. In security appliances, it's happening at a very rapid rate because this is becoming largely that initial foothold for threat actor groups. I think because my theory is it's much easier to quietly compromise some appliance hanging off on the network than it is for me to conduct a phishing attack or email phishing and trick a user to click a link, that kind of thing. That still happens, don't get me wrong, but if I can quietly, be due to lack of visibility and monitoring, compromise a security appliance as my initial foothold as an attacker, that's great for attackers, right? Let's not give them that. Let's make sure
Yep.
we're trying to wipe that out of their
This
arsenal.
this ties into my second point I wanted to make actually. Second point is that firmware like vendors for different devices like routers, firewalls, all of the hardware boxes, they should finally implement automatic updates
Yeah,
that don't break your device.
agree.
Like when you update your router, you always have this fear that this update is gonna break it.
Yep,
So you don't update it because of this, and this is why it takes so long for all of the companies to update their devices. And what should happen instead is that it's not the responsibility of the company that owns the device, it should be responsibility of the vendor to automatically update their device. Like imagine that, like in a perfect world, we have a security vendor A, and they release a patch, and within 10 minutes, they push it to all of their devices. Well, whatever customers at least can reach their update servers. Obviously,
sure.
it's not gonna be also nice and easy, but let's just say that for devices that are actually exposed to the internet or have internet access, they can pull firmware like every 20 minutes. And oh, hey, there is a new firmware update. It can just apply it and go ahead and restart. Or prompt an admin, okay, I just downloaded an update. Click the button when you think it's safe for me to update from SLA perspective and whatever, right? If we were living in this world, vendor A would be pretty much more secure than any other.
I
Because
agree.
simply speed of updates would be so phenomenal that attackers would have very little chance to actually chase after them.
Yeah, but I
Moreover,
think we're
they
we're
can
hitting on
silently patch bugs.
yeah, but we're hitting on great points, right? So the first point was web management interfaces have to be more resilient, right? So improve your software development lifecycle, squash those bugs before they get pushed out, right? There's lots of tools. We could do a whole hour podcast. I've done several hour
Yup,
podcasts on that topic, right? The second thing I
yup.
love, Vlad, is automatic updates. That we largely don't, I don't believe many of these appliances that I'm looking at have that automatic update. A lot of IoT devices don't have that. Some do. I want to say the one example that always pops in my mind is my Ring doorbell. Before they were acquired by Google, they had a great firmware update process and it was automatic, right? So that technology and that it does exist, it has been deployed. I think a second tier to the automatic updates that I really want to advocate for in our industry is separation of security patches from feature updates, right? So as an administrator, and look, I live this And it was a long time ago, but I was the security person at a university, largely responsible for firewalls and assisting the network team in maintaining the network infrastructure as well. So very heavily involved anytime they were going to apply firmware updates, looking at their configurations and their firmware versions and making recommendations and assisting with that. And it's every organization has this problem. You have a network device that runs half of your campus, right? There's thousands of students. When they all come back to school, I can't go, oh, you know what? I got to apply a firmware update to that main that main router or switch because the network could be down. It's going to be down when you apply the update, but oh my god, it could be down because of some other problem. If you separate as a vendor the security fixes perhaps from the rest of the mainline updates, that reduces your operational risk, right? In other words, I just want the patch that fixes the hole in my web management interface. What often happens is that firmware update is bundled with other changes that could also impact operational functioning. And so by separating them, I think you can do a better job. Like it's similar to Microsoft, right? Patch Tuesday, that kind of thing. They still do some bundling in there too, but I think that's a solid approach.
So what this would put is pressure to always stay up with latest major version.
Yeah.
So it's still gonna be
Yeah.
a problem in some sense. And just how long the vendor would support a specific version with patches, right? It's not always so nice and shiny and so easy, right? So sometimes what happens is that the vendor will simply not support a specific version you are on for whatever reason. And you will be pushed into following always a very specific version. Like in this department, I really like Ubuntu's policy. I actually don't know if I'm reading it right in English, but they have LTS releases which live
Yeah.
for like 5 years. So I don't particularly care about getting absolute latest features on my Linux box, right? But I care that it's supported for 5 years and they're gonna get
Right.
updates for a while.
No, it's
I
a
don't
great
have to go ahead
example.
and reinstall it.
Yeah.
But quite a few vendors don't have anything of the sort.
No, they push you to the
So,
latest major release. And I was looking some of that again, not to pick on
yep,
Palo Alto, but because I had to
it's
look
all of
at it
them.
for Palo Alto, right? I had to look at, well, we evaluated this device. Like, is the hardware supported? What level of support is it in? And then also the software, what is the latest version that it supports and what's the support for that software, right? And so IT teams are obviously doing this for all of their devices, and it's a very tedious task.
Yep.
And interesting to track that. Like I know my hardware is going to be supported for this long, but it's only going to be supported up to this software, and those could be different dates that go end of life. So
Yep.
Yeah, it's a
And
disincentive for the users to update because it's so the possibility that it'll break something unpredictable
yeah,
is far more compelling to them than the possibility that it'll prevent some
mhm,
attack that's been positioned as unlikely to happen
hmm
anyway. We talk about incentives every time we get on on this
hmm
topic. I
yep,
feel like you can't talk about cybersecurity without talking about incentives though. I feel like they need like the insurance companies have the incentive where it's like if you wear a health tracker,
yeah, right,
we'll give you a Fitbit, and if you wear it and you hit a certain amount of steps, you get some money off your premium. It's like if
yeah,
you stay up to date on your firmware, you get it cheaper. I guess that's
yeah.
kind of built into contracts
There's
because
no,
it's
yeah,
like,
but there's no incentive, right? That if you're the IT person responsible for upgrading any of these devices, you're disincentivized to upgrade them because if you
yep,
apply an update and then any problem that happens after that, I can attest to this, right? Any problem that happens, they're gonna be like, "Hey, you updated firmware on that thing. That might be causing this problem that we're having, right? You
yeah.
need to back out the change, or you need to now drop everything you're doing." And troubleshoot this problem. And is it a problem? Is it a security incident? Is it an operational incident? But fingers are pointing at you as the IT person going, you applied that firmware update and that could have broke things.
And if it saves you from an attack, you never know about that.
Right, exactly.
Because the perennial problem is that the best, if nothing happens, that's great, but nobody gets any credit.
Right. It's true. I also think it's interesting too that we looked at firewalls years ago as providing that hard and crunchy outside and the soft and chewy center, and I think many of the companies today still have that threat model of, as long as you protect the perimeter of your firewall device, don't worry about if there's vulnerabilities on the inside, as long as you don't expose the web management interface and do the best practices, like you'll be okay. And I think what I'd
Hmm.
also like to advocate for is that we keep these platforms up to date holistically, right? That we have visibility into them, that we have an SBOM so we know what's inside of them, and that we get these regular updates, because you can't just like put a door in front of it and have put a sign that says unauthorized access but put no lock on the door, right? Or no camera facing the door, right? We have to do several things in order to be secure, but we're at a disadvantage when we're implementing these things that are, have that brittle outside, hard and crunchy, but on the inside, attackers can do whatever they want because they haven't, patched things that shouldn't be accessible under normal conditions, but through vulnerabilities are. And that's where I think we largely disagree with this, the threat model that's out there in common in this sector.
So to be honest, to add to this, what we are sitting is when all of those appliances were specialized devices. Like think about home routers like 15 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
They were like maybe a single binary firmware. Like they maybe had 8 megabytes. Now all of these platforms, even home ones, are really major. Like my home router has 1 gigabyte of RAM and has a full out operating system installation. So it's just incomparable. We are working with devices which are essentially look like a circle, walk like a server, but just aren't,
Yeah.
but also have all of the stuff on the inside. But for some reason, they decided that it's still great to follow the model that you had with the 8 megabyte device, which didn't have
Right.
anything to be exploited on the inside in the first place. Devices became much more advanced, but the model and perception of the customer didn't change. What customers should start pushing for is that vendors must stop providing them firewalls which have like soft insides. And it's not just firewalls, it's any security device. It's
Mm.
any device that's even related to your security. So your router, which is not immediately a security appliance, still is under the same pressure. Because
Yeah.
until we start doing this pressure as just general people onto these companies, nothing will change. In
But I think
contracts, in everywhere.
one thing that's changed, Vlad, to your point, is over in the past 20 years, I hate using the word commodity because that's kind of not what I'm getting at. But in the past 20 years, the hardware and firmware and software has become more commodity. In other words, if you want to build an appliance today, you can do that probably more cheaply running an Intel platform that runs Linux than you
Yep.
could, if you're talking 25 plus years ago, you wanted some specialized device. It really was specialized in your hardware and software, right? Linux had not matured, the Linux kernel had not matured enough to be as ubiquitous as it is today, right? Now, most devices are underneath the covers, right? Running
Yep.
some kind of standard processor and some kind of standard operating system, standard bootloader, and many of them are using the standard UEFI for good reason.
Yep.
Those platforms offer great levels of security, but as we're observing in the case of a DNA sequencer or a Palo Alto firewall,
Yep.
the security controls we have at our disposal for this technology aren't being implemented or being
Like
implemented incorrectly.
we have bugs from the 90s. We have Stack
Mm-hmm.
Overflows. We even have SQL injections in them. Like I personally found one. So I'm not gonna name drop with vendor. You can
Yeah,
find it
sure.
on Eclipsium blog, I guess. But like it's not about shaming a specific vendor in this case. These devices are not supposed to have SQL injections. They're not supposed to
Right.
have Stack Overflows. They're not supposed to have stuff that's this easy to break. Like at the very least, like if I saw those attacks being like a crazy chain of 26 little bugs,
Mm-hmm.
all had to align together, and then attacker had to apply a lot of creativity to actually bypass them. Great, but we see one shot SQL injections that just leaks had been hashed, you brute force it, I guess. Or another great one is what we found on the BMC chip is pretty much just add this specific header, and suddenly you bypass all of authentication.
Mm-hmm. Right, and I
So,
think that attackers are looking at this attack surface kind of drooling at the mouth, right? Because it
yep,
doesn't require a whole lot of special tooling. In other words,
yep,
oh, if I can exploit this vulnerability, it's Linux underneath, and I have at my disposal a
yep,
whole 30-year history of tools that I can deploy, as it
yep,
was the case for Juniper,
yep.
right? Not
It
picking on
it gets
Juniper,
worse.
but
It gets
Juniper,
worse.
the underlying operating system, they deploy like a 25-year-old backdoor. Right? Like the Fenelon Group wrote about that in
It
2001, but they can put it on a modern appliance because it's
yep.
using Linux with a processor architecture that they can get it working.
It gets even worse if you think about it. It's an appliance where administrator has no visibility into the file
Mm,
system. So
yes,
not only
yes,
can they put it in there, admin is never going to look there, is never going to be able to look there without exploiting the same vulnerabilities. And no tool can look in there unless the appliance actually allows it or the tool
right.
actually exploits the appliance. So
Right, right. We've had those
so
discussions of how do we gain access to this
how
platform
do we
to help
like
defend it? Like, yeah.
in this case, like, yeah, it's a problem Eclipse constantly faces. We
Mm,
do try to solve it. In some cases we do, in some cases we can't. It's like spotty depending on the vendor, but it's not a very easy task to actually get into that appliance in the first place to check it. And even if you do, you sometimes have a limited view. And even then, if you as an attacker just see that appliance and then you look at the Windows machine with all of the modern EDRs, patch management,
mhm.
and like all of the data leak preventions mechanism, all of the antivirus software that the company might want you to install, and they're looking like, nah, hell no, I'll just go to the CPN appliance and sit there forever. And in
Right.
many
And if it
cases,
is interesting too, if it works, and this is where I empathize with the folks who have older hardware, firmware, and software deployed in your environment. I get that because it works. So why am I going to take the operational risk if it's solving the problem I have, it's functioning perfectly fine, but now I'm forced to update it because there's security vulnerabilities, because there's new firmware, or the appliance hardware isn't supported anymore. These
yep.
appliances have tons of horsepower now, right? I think we're beyond many
Mm-hmm.
of the devices that are highly specialized hardware and firmware, where now it's more a commodity that's underneath because it's performant enough. And not only is it performant enough, it's performant enough that you could have it for 5+ years and it's still doing the job just fine. So that's the other problem.
Yep. And
I want to I want to jump back to a question
go ahead.
about auto updates, but
Mm.
if you had something else on this topic, you should go for it because I'm going to
No.
rewind us back to a prior topic a little bit.
I wanted to go to the topic pretty much as well, so you
All
hit the spot.
right, all right. Auto updates. Um, so we talk a lot about supply chain security. It's a big part of what we do. The SolarWinds attack specifically leveraged the software update path in a world where there is widely deployed and accepted and used automatic update path. Does How does that make what is the different risk that introduces, or what's the risk trade-off when you're letting a
So
company
great
push?
question. Yeah.
They have that mothership connection, you're letting them push automatically either without you or with you, clicking a
Right.
modal.
New software. You
um
get new software, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
So let me tell you a story which is kind of not related to firmware world, but happened. So there was a malware called NotPetya, I believe back in 2017,
Hmm.
and it happened in Ukraine. And the story there is that they managed to exploit a bunch of vulnerabilities that were disclosed as part of an NSA leak.
Yep.
But what was not mentioned as widely is that there was a software called MeDoc, m.e.doc, right, which was used by Ukrainian government to file taxes. And that
I
software did
remember
two
that. Yep.
things. Thing number one, they did software updates without signatures. And thing number two,
Hmm.
that software required you for no reason, by the way, to run as administrator. So what happened is that attacker got to the update server, managed to drop infected versions there, keep it there for half a year, and then they pretty much just sprang it. And suddenly the entire Ukraine was on fire. So there are two lessons here to learn. First, your update process should ideally somehow, verify what it downloads. So there should be strict signature checks, etc., etc. And lesson number two, human involvement might be useful. Like it would be great if as a human I would be able to see, oh hey, this software is just going to be installed and you are asked to validate it, and until you press yes, the update process does not proceed. And you sign a specific like firmware hash that's going to be updated or something like this with this yes click, for example. So there are a whole bunch of ways to actually make it a little bit more secure. It does not need to be entirely non-transparent. What should happen is that signature checks are a must with a strict protection of the signing key for any respectable vendor, and that would make sense. I mean, if you have a multi-billion-dollar company or even a multi-million-dollar company, getting some kind of signature process is not supposed to be hard for you. Like you can buy all of that. It's not that pricey for you.
Yeah,
And
one of
then
my co-podcasters
transparency.
said that, right? Like if you have a company, you produce these devices, you are in an advantage, right? When you go, I want to validate the platform when I apply updates, when I issue
Yep.
new firmware, because you tightly control that environment. Many of the problems that we've seen, specifically with UEFI, are because of the complex supply chain and how anyone can go make not anyone, but right, like a lot of companies can go make a PC, can get an operating system from Microsoft, can use an Intel platform, and then there's processes for going, okay, how do I build on top of that to protect updates and provide security, implement secure boot and those things. When you come down to a company that makes appliances for security, that task is a lot easier, right? And Palo Alto did some, I mean, to their credit, they did some of this, right? If you're going to implement secure boot, you don't need to have everyone, keys and allow third party CAs to incorporate
You just need yours.
signed bootloader. You just need yours, right? Like what software is on the device, what hardware is there. So secure boot can be just your keys, and Palo Alto did that to their credit. Now they didn't
Again,
update it, right? It's a continuous process. When you own the validation process for secure boot, you also own the process for observing when software has vulnerabilities and should be on the revocation list. You then have to update the revocation list, and that's the step that was missed with Palo Alto. So hopefully this is now moving in the right direction for our industry, where vendors are going to go, oh, if we're doing this ourselves, we have to keep it up to date, because someone's going to lift up the covers and realize that stuff is not up to date. We're running a vulnerable piece of software inside of secure boot, which completely invalidates. I mean, in most cases, right, like completely invalidates any protections from secure boot.
And and I'm gonna drop you a free idea, whoever wants to pick it up. Imagine that your appliance is only running executables which are signed in the first place. Like
That's
you
what
can
my
apply an operating
co-podcaster said. He's
system.
like, why do
Yep.
they need to run any other binaries in the firmware?
Yep. They can. It's not just firmware. It can be firmware of the device, but it's kind of software of the device. If you speak about
Right.
UEFI's firmware, like your Linux box can have a configuration or a patch or call it whatever. You control it, so it's not impossible for you, and it can only accept binaries, like for example ls, which have a signature from you.
Right.
It doesn't accept anything else.
And
So
that's
this way,
today. That was going to be a question
Yep.
that I had, Vlad, and I probably should have asked you before the show, but that's totally possible, right? Whether it lives in the kernel or relies on some
Yep.
other keys stored in firmware or fuses or whatever, right? It's possible to go, these are the only things that can run from the firmware level all the way up through the operating system. This is what should be running. If an attacker
Yep.
compromises that and tries to run some other binary, it should be reject. Now, obviously there's bypasses that exist for that, but that raises the bar dramatic. I mean, there's
this will be a huge dramatic bar, because suddenly you're limited to only tools which are on device, and if you create them properly, you will not have a lot of exploitable tools.
Right.
So, for example, imagine that you don't provide you a netcat, you don't provide the curl, you don't provide a wget, you don't provide any of the popular tools which attackers would use to exfiltrate data, and what attacker is supposed to do now. So one of the point of
Yeah, I
contention
mean, you
here
can
might be
use
having a scripting language, but still,
you can use bash to create pipes that go to the network stack, but I'm sure you could disable that as well.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
You
you
could
can
really make it hard.
do.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can make it really hard to even just connect to something from the device, let alone like run something. Yeah, of course there'll be bypasses like if you sign a Python binary,
Sure.
well, you just
Yeah.
shot yourself in the leg.
Right.
Make sure you don't do stupid stuff when you do this. But if you create your list of binaries well, it's gonna raise the bar very high.
Yeah,
Suddenly,
and
attacker will be playing an uphill battle, and
I mean
20 minutes
this
exploits will not be possible anymore.
it sometimes gets the label of zero trust. I've actually seen this in action in products in the market, right? Of implementing a zero trust policy to do exactly what we're talking about, right? Like it's one thing to lock it down in the operating system and or firmware, but there's also technology that exists that implements zero trust that goes, even if you execute the Python binary, it has ways to put guardrails around that. So yeah, this technology certainly exists. And like we said, I think it's easier to implement on a closed system where you control the hardware and
Yep.
software.
Yep, in this case, nobody's gonna bring you a new binary. Like, it's
Mm-hmm.
much harder to implement on a normal computer, but that's your appliance. You only have what you supplied there. You can sign everything that
Right.
you need, and everything else suddenly cannot run. Even if you don't properly curate the list of binaries and use them in development, you don't use them in production, you can just leave them in, just don't sign them, and they will be just garbage binaries. Attackers can bring those anyways.
Right. Right. Right.
So you don't even have that tight requirement to even curate what you supply. You just need to curate what you sign, which is easier.
Mm. I think that's a great strategy. It was Sam Bound on my Security Weekly podcast was saying the same thing. And it also is a great segue into some of the UEFI vulnerabilities that were present on certain models of Palo Alto firewalls that we found. And one of those was insecure flash access control. Now, here's my take on it. I think Palo Alto's response is correct, where they state PanOS does not have any a facility that would allow someone to exploit the vulnerability. And I think what they're saying, right, to put in more technical terms, is like we don't ship flash ROM, which allows you to write to the spy flash with PanOS, right? And what we saw in the Sophos specific RIM attacks was attackers using tools like FTP to bring down additional binaries, such as flash ROM, to then be able to exploit missing security protections to get into UEFI, to implant inside of UEFI, to live there to persist firmware updates.
Yep.
They had other firmware persistence mechanisms, but they were experimenting in the case of Sophos specific RIM with this specific attack vector, which I think was a boot. I think it was a boot guard bypass that they were experimenting with. So I think that's where Palo Alto's coming from. I think that the right answer is what you suggested, Vlad, is don't let an attackers bring tools down on these
Yeah,
devices, right?
make it at least much harder. Like
Mm,
obviously there are gonna be vulnerabilities like a stack overflow in some of the binaries, which you might not be able to revoke quickly enough.
right.
Sure, maybe it will be bypassable, but even if there is stack overflow, suddenly you cannot just execute bash or execute flash ROM. You have to actually bring that functionality in the form of shellcode, and suddenly you have memory problems.
Yep.
Suddenly you have challenges to actually be able to run it. So it's not, it's gonna make attackers game much harder.
Yeah. No, completely agree. We do see firmware encryption being employed, right? And I that's a double-edged sword. When the firmware is encrypted, it makes it harder to do any kind of validation for security
Yeah.
researchers when the firmware is encrypted, but does raise the bar in terms of security. And like most guides you read for most platforms are like, look, if you want security, you need to have some kind of secure boot, which is available on many platforms, and you should do firmware encryption, right? Or either flash.
Firmware encryption is security through obscurity. It's not gonna work. Yes, it raises the bar,
Mhm.
but like it's going to be possible to decrypt. Device decrypts it, hence can the attacker.
Yes. Yes.
It's going to raise the bar for defenders as well. So, but attackers with like infinite amount of time, like let's imagine an APT group of 100 people who are really qualified. Let's say it's not that hard to imagine a big APT group, right?
Yeah.
They have resources to actually sit down and go step by step on the device boot process and find when exactly it decrypts the firmware, and suddenly they can pull the decrypted image. Or firmware encryption is not always implemented properly, and there
Yep.
was an interesting case. I do believe it was Zuxel. I don't
Yep.
remember if it was them or not, where you could actually just break a legacy zip crypto stream with 12 known bytes, which they thankfully provided to us. And you could
Yeah.
just break
Yeah.
their encryption key entirely. So it's not so easy to actually implement proper firmware encryption.
No, it's
So
very true.
so in this case, like encryption is not the way to go. Signatures are. You want to sign your firmware with your public key, private key to which only you have. And
Right.
then even if they can read firmware, they can no longer modify it. Like encryption, it is not gonna save you.
No, and it also, I mean, vendor's perspective too, right? It complicates any update process in
Yup.
terms of key rotation. What happens if that private key leaks, which happens, or what happens for whatever reason you need to rotate keys. Now it's kind of it depends on the platform, right? It can be tricky.
Yeah.
It can be tricky. I'm actually
It
this
becomes
week I'm
tricky.
getting ready to publish an article on the ESP32 platform, and it fuses keys on the actual device. But it only has four total locations, 4 or 5 total locations to fuse keys. One of those being the first block is actually for secure boot on or off. So once secure boot gets turned on that platform, it can't be turned off because it's fused into a key, right? Now, you do have other fuses that if you use the second block rather to fuse a key, you can then use the third block to fuse a new key and switch to that one. I believe that's what, if I understand it all correctly, that they're recommending.
Yeah.
And it uses those fuses both for storage of keys for secure boot and firmware
Yeah.
encryption.
Yeah, key management is gonna be a question. Like, I'm not gonna lie, I'm not providing a ready-made recipe for a full solution. What I'm
Right,
saying
right.
is that even if that key gets leaked, it's still a massive bar race because now you have to find that key, you have to leak it,
Yeah, sure.
you have to fight for it. It's still this game is not about making a perfectly secure platform. That's a nonsensical thing, it doesn't exist. It's about raising the attacker's game bar so high that it's no longer like tasty for them to actually attack the platform.
Yeah.
It's no longer to their gain. They have to actually fight an uphill battle to do this. And that's when the attacks will stop. Or else they will not stop because some targets are just too tasty and too big,
Right.
but they will become much less prevalent.
Yeah, sure. And that's all we can ask, right? Like people still attack Microsoft Windows, but go back 25 years, Microsoft has made huge strides to make that a lot more difficult for attackers, right? Chrome has done the same thing with Chrome, not Chrome OS, but Chrome browser, right? But again, those are mega companies, but I think we need to start putting these notions and driving the rest of the industry to follow suit, to be like, you need to raise the bar for attackers. Doesn't have to be perfect, but especially when we talk about network and security appliances, it needs to be a much more difficult target to attack, because today it's too easy. And
Yes.
that's evidenced by the number of attacks that we're seeing, right, against this particular type of infrastructure.
Yeah,
Yes.
it's like some of these vendors are like too big to too big to fail, or like there's not a consequence when even when a huge incident happens, a blue screen of death type of things happen, nobody's getting rid of the vendor, or the amount of consequence that there is from even a huge vulnerability is not that bad, and so the companies aren't competing on how secure they are. That would be awesome if companies were competing to be like the most secure one. But there's such vendor lock-in. It's so hard to switch off of one of these platforms once you're on it.
Some are switching. I mean, I did talk to one company that was making that decision based on security. And I think that's becoming increasingly a trend as a spotlight is shined on this area. But But I think for the most part, you're right, Chase. Like, there's lots of other factors that come into play when choosing a platform, right? And um, cost is one, but manageability is another one, right? And again, it comes down to, if I'm managing a large organization, am I going to go with OpenSense on, hardware? Probably not, right? I need to manage 100 firewalls, and I need that enterprise grade software, because there are
Yep.
some that are suggesting that, what if we move to the pfSense and OpenWRT, because they're open source, they're a lot more resilient, right? Largely because they're open source, right? But also because a lot of people have looked at the code. They're locked down that code pretty well. I mean, latest versions of pfSense and OpenWrt are pretty secure. I follow the threat landscape pretty closely, right? But when we go into an enterprise setting, that's not a reality, right? I mean, you could, if you want to create a startup, look, and take the open source code, and go create enterprise grade stuff. I think that's great. But I think the reason enterprises buy the bigger named enterprise gear is for all of those other features and manageability. It's what is Fortinet calls it, FortiManager, right? I don't want to say it's Expedition on Palo Alto. I want to say it might be something different. Uh, Zixil, Vlad, when you looked at it, right, they had a provisioning management protocol to
Yeah.
manage multiple devices, right? So Cisco has DNA, right? So there's a lot of enterprise level features that are, I think, one of the driving factors behind, if I have a large enterprise, I go with these vendors because I get the tools and manageability that I need.
Oh, I just Googled it and it looks like Palo Alto Expedition is what it was called, and it's EOL this month.
Oh, interesting. So I wasn't sure if that
Um,
was the importer, where if you had another company's firewall infrastructure, Expedition allowed you to
oh,
import
you're
it.
right. It is.
Is
It
that
is.
what that? I think that's what
It's
it
the
is.
migration.
It's
It's
the
the migration
migration tool.
tool.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
don't
yeah,
remember they must have a product to manage similar to FortiManager, right?
yeah. Panorama firewall
Ah, yes,
manager. Yeah,
yeah. Panorama,
yeah, yeah.
yes.
Not EOL.
No, yeah, because again, I think that's why, like, if I'm managing 100 firewalls, right, and I want to go with a vendor, I want a management framework to manage all that stuff.
So yeah, I googled it and like it looks like it is EOL, but they are actually not getting rid of its functionality. They are migrating it into new products.
Right,
So
right.
it looks like fake alarm. They're not closing it down.
Mm-hmm. Oh boy. Well, we covered some great ground. I think lots of good recommendations. One of the recommendations I put out there on social media, when I was trying to shine a spotlight on our research for Palo Alto, was do the detection and monitoring around these firewalls themselves very, very closely, right? Like, you might need to change how you monitor. I mean, logs are one thing, but monitoring the network traffic to the management interfaces, them to the firewalls themselves, I think is critically important in today's day and age, especially when I looked at the C door, right? The old backdoor. It's kind of like single packet authentication. If you I read the Ars Technica article, and it was basically like the software sits there in memory and it looks for certain characteristics inside of packets. And when it sees that, then it opens up the back door. And when I read some of the characteristics, I'm like, if this was Paul 20 plus years ago, I could write a snort rule without looking at the documentation to detect this anomalous behavior. It was like, this field in the TCP header is this, and TCP options are set to this, and this field is this length or has this value. I'm like, intrusion detection systems have been able to write signatures that detect exactly this, right? It was kind of like my first foray into security was running intrusion detection
Yep.
systems. And so, but fast forward today, we need those same facilities, right? We need to be able to monitor our devices for anomalous traffic.
Yep.
Well, awesome.
Exactly.
Well, Vlad and Chase, thank you very much for joining me today on Below the Surface. Thank you, everyone, for listening and watching this episode. That'll conclude our episode for today. We'll see everyone next time.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.